Everyone seeks the good, even though some people commit rape, murder, theft, they commit injustice, they commit evil, yet they don't do these things for the sake of the evil contained in those actions. They do them always for the sake of some good that they see in the ends of their action, whether that is pleasure for themselves, power for themselves, possibly the good of another, if we're dealing with like a Robin Hood type scenario. But the good that we see in an action and the end of that action are convertible terms. It's tautology in praxeology to say that everything pursues its good. Schopenhauer puts it in the most direct way. Everything has a principle of sufficient reason behind being what it is. There's some ground underlying every event, action, entity. And so human actions are always grounded in motives. And a motive is a motive because of this distinguishing feature. It has a power to attract our behavior. It has the power to be a goal because of the good that it contains. You can try to think about what a goal would look like without any goodness inherent in it. I think that will be a fruitless endeavor, but you're welcome to try and then share your thoughts on that. Plato maintained that everyone seeks the good, but we often make mistakes about what is actually good for us. We have the wrong idea about what we are. We identify with our body and we attempt to satisfy our bodily appetites, but then we neglect our higher aspect, our soul. And our soul becomes withered, it becomes of a lesser quality. Perhaps it faces punishment in the other world. So it's important that we understand what we are and what our actual good is. Not the goals that we perceive, but the goal that we would have if we had perfect knowledge. That should be the goal of philosophy. So that puts us in a predicament. We know we're liable to suffering, and we know that we make mistakes about what will yield suffering and what will yield the good life. So basically, what can you do other than pursue philosophically the truth? You have to pursue wisdom. Now, you can take a whole system, a philosophical system or theological system, just as it stands and believe all of it without actually knowing any of it. You can take something as a belief, but if you don't know the causes underlying it, then you don't really know it. It's like you can claim to know relativity because you know some of the physical consequences of the theory, but you don't actually know it unless you know how it works. You have to understand the mechanism, grasp the causal connections involved in the theory in order to really know it. So you can believe wholesale in some particular stripe of Christianity, Islam, whatever. But if you don't really know it, you are taking a risk. Right? We don't feel like we take risks about things that we know very well. We never have perfect knowledge, but when it comes to things like, how to wash our hands, we have a clear goal in mind that, we know in a very intimate, intuitive, visceral way, getting our hands clean. We know the tools we need, We know what to do, the procedure to follow, and we can get that good that we perceive. We think it's good to have clean hands because this has been demonstrated in many occasions throughout our lives. We don't soil our clothing, and I don't know, our video game controller doesn't get all crusty if we wash our hands. This is a good. We can be relatively certain about that because it's something that we know, right? So knowing something well involves a reduction of the risk that we assume in following a given course of behavior. If we know it well, we know the hazards, we know the benefits in it. Whereas if we simply have belief, we, by definition, don't know if it's a true belief or not. But, obviously not all people engage in philosophical reasoning. Not all people will be aware of that distinction between belief and knowledge. They won't be aware of the kind of moral hazard and the danger in believing things without actually knowing them. And this kind of connects to the distinction between Christian goodness, as it has been conceived over the last couple millennia, and the more ancient classical notions of virtue. Right? For the ancients, goodness was not conformity. It wasn't primarily conformity with a source of goodness. It was being good at things. The goodness a person contains is in their abilities. Now, there's something that feels off about that to us today. We think that goodness belongs to the meek. It belongs to the poor in spirit, right? So how do we reconcile this? How do we think of our goodness? On the one hand, there's the goal that we should be seeking, and that involves true belief, justified true belief, knowledge of ourselves, our nature, and whatever it is we need to achieve in order to get to that good place we want. We need to know that. But involved in that is the kind of character we have to have. If we want to get to the good, we're going to have to be good. And that's in one of two ways, right? The Christian concept has traditionally been to conform yourself to a higher will, to conform yourself to basically the right side of history. This notion has spilled over into modern secular humanist conceptions of goodness, and you can be good even if you're not actually useful to society. Just by being on the right side, you are good. I think we can all see a problem in that kind of logic. You can see why it would emerge. It helps a group to form. It provides an incentive for someone to join a group. Instead of doing hard work and attaining excellence in your capacities, you can just, profess to belong to the right side. And that's something that happens with Christians as well. So maybe we're misunderstanding the Bible in some ways, or maybe we're not grasping something, because it does seem like that issue of individual excellence has waned in its significance. If you're not good at things, then how can you be good for anyone else? To do good for another, you have to have the ability to do good for them. Now, I suppose God could use you as a fool who has no abilities, but just like kind of by happenstance is at the right place at the right time. Say like, you're walking down the road carrying a jar of water that you've taken from a well, and someone who's dying of thirst just traveled across a desert comes up to you and needs that water. Well, you can help them. The Spirit can move you to help them. It didn't really take great ability on your part. But how often are those circumstances going to occur? I guess that's a matter of faith, right? Some people might believe that they don't need to pay any special attention to cultivating their abilities, right? There are many Christians who never learn math, who never learn like the history of philosophy, history in general, civics, how economics works, and yet they vote and yet they do things. They feel like justified by, like, I am a good person because I'm a Christian. They feel justified to do things in the world. And they kind of think that like God will just providentially attend everything to work out for the best. But aren't you increasing the odds that you'll be able to do good for others if you actually acquire the necessary abilities? Right? This is the question. How do we reconcile the classical concept of excellence with the Christian concept of goodness? Well, in assimilating ourselves to the will of God, we are acting as part of his body, and so we will have the abilities that he has. We'll kind of be a vessel for his energies to enter into the world. However, still, like, cultivation of yourself is a necessary precondition of that. Also, membership in that larger body is a precondition of that. You have to live in community with others. When we are trying to become good today, we often try to do this by ourselves, by reading the New Testament, maybe going to church, but then we attend a small group, and like the church is just kind of a place that we go to. It's not our literal community. We read philosophy, we work out, we do these things, but that's not how we evolved to be, right? We can't expect to arrive at a healthy state of being, a virtuous state of being, unless we are surrounded by people who lead us that way. You need a virtuous community to become maximally good, in my opinion, right? You might have natural virtues, but unless you are habituated by a community that reinforces your better qualities, it's unlikely that you're going to fulfill your potential, right? It's like epistatic inheritance in genetics. There are certain experiences you need to have in order for certain capacities, certain genetic potentials to be actuated. So, people try to become virtuous without actually having that precondition of virtue. Maybe you move past that at some point in your life. You don't need a community past a certain point, but the scale of virtues, the ladder of virtues, as conceived by the Neoplatonists, begins with this natural capacity. You either have that from birth or you don't, right? You are better or worse as a result of your birth. Of course, for them, you've earned that. It's not a roll of the dice. People like to say that today, but you've earned your quality. It is who you are. You are responsible for your natural abilities. It's not just like a gift. And then you have the habituated virtues of just being raised in a family, getting basic advice from your elders, learning language, these sorts of things. That has been interrupted. And many people, in my country, of my background, have been neglected in favor of others for ideological reasons. What I mean by that is a young man with capacities, with natural abilities, would have been cultivated by the people around him in traditional societies. They would see that this is a potential warrior for our tribe. This is a potential statesman. We want to cultivate the youth. That's one of the main reasons in Greece that you had this kind of relationship between older men and younger men. It wasn't just about some perverted desire, although some people allowed that to get the best of them. Socrates never did, Plato never did. For them, it was about cultivating the youth, seeing the divine in them. And, beauty of form is associated with beauty of the soul. The soul causes the body for Platonists, and other ancient Greek philosophical schools shared that opinion about physiognomy. So they would see that beauty and see it as a sign of a higher energy, and they would want to bring that youth to fulfillment. They would want to educate him, look after him. Did you have that sort of treatment? Not that you were courted by older men, but did you have role models that were looking after you? In my upbringing, the Gen X people that were around who were older never spoke to me. I never made contact with the people who were 10, 15, 20 years older than me. I interacted with teachers, but often, I did well in school, and I would kind of be pushed to the side in favor of someone who didn't have my background, someone who was female, because that's, the notion of justice they had in their mind. Someone who looks like me shouldn't be promoted, shouldn't be fostered. So that has its consequences. Now there are many people similar to me in my background who have natural capacities but never were properly habituated. And that's the second step on the ladder. It's not really up to you. You can try to make up for that, but without that community, you're not going to actualize your capacities. That's why I stress community so strongly. It's not just a conscious thing. It is all the way down to the core of our subconscious. Like when we're infants, we interface with community. It's there before language. The archetypes are there inevitably. And when an archetype is unfulfilled in perception, it develops a life of its own, right? And sometimes becomes pathological. People who, never had a proper father figure, for example, often have this weight hanging over them, a sense that they, never got that approval they wanted. They never had, they're missing something. There's a hole in their lives that they're trying to fill. People like that, try to embody that paternal archetype, but then because it's not grounded in empirical reality, it sways, it varies, as the beliefs of that individual vary. And so they kind of become like a monstrous father figure rather than actually living up to the archetype and becoming that true character. They don't know that character. They just kind of have a hunch about what it is. They try to be it. They try to look for it, never fully satisfying it. And people like that are not to blame for their circumstance. It's the fathers who left them. It's the society that allowed it to happen. But we need it at a deep level. So beyond that level, we have the civic virtues. Those are the 4 cardinal virtues from the Republic, right? Wisdom being chief, justice, courage, and temperance. Wisdom being excellence of the rational faculty, and ultimately intellect being the summit of reason, that source through which we justify the truth of axioms, right? The lower elements of reason, dianoia, have to do with comparing different statements, organizing the syllogism, but the truth of those logical operations, the truth of the axioms that we're using has to be derived from something. That's like the intuitionist school of thought in mathematics or logic. The intellect holds all of those intuitions and is universal, although we have varying degrees of access to it. So wisdom is striving after intellect. And as a political virtue, just excellence of dianoia, the reasoning faculty, is about what we can expect. And justice is each part of the soul, each aspect of our psyche fulfilling its proper role, and also in civic affairs, each person doing his own business. Courage is thumos, its ability to regulate what we perceive as a danger. Courage is a wisdom to know what is truly dangerous for us, right? Not to be swayed by the feelings in the moment in battle, the feeling in the moment when you're approaching a girl, right? It's always overcoming that feeling that you get by knowing that a higher good is out there. So it's thumos, the spirited energies, in the service of logos. And it doesn't completely dominate epithumia or appetite. It doesn't completely suppress the bodily life, but it makes sure that there is a proper order. And temperance is the virtue of epithumia to regulate itself according to benefit rational principles. But you don't even need rational principles to have some level of temperance. Even the merchant who has no higher ambition of wisdom or courage can still have a kind of prudence where they only give in to those necessary desires and they don't indulge in the spendthrift, wasteful desires that people who aren't even at the level of the merchant indulge in. So those virtues have to be cultivated through wisdom. Wisdom is the chief of those virtues, the indispensable condition. Although I did just say you can have temperance without wisdom to a degree. I mean, it's a kind of wisdom. And then beyond that level, well, there is the intellect itself. And the rational faculty has the ability to move up into it and away from our bodily nature. So that next kind of virtue is purificatory virtue, catharsis. We let go of our bodily attachments and have the life of intellect in itself. And being able to do that is only possible when you've reached a kind of culmination of temperance, courage, justice, and that more mundane kind of wisdom. So you learn how to separate off and see, make contact with intellect. And that is its own skill, detachment, learning how to do that. And then you move beyond detachment into contemplation. So you're dealing with the realm of forms. You're seeing the reason principles of the world, the logoi, in your own soul. You're living the life of the soul, exploring it. And that phase of life is the philosophical life, where you explore all of these subtleties about metaphysics, all the subtleties of psychology and its interface with cosmology, the whole picture, right? And you couldn't expect to know your own nature unless you had moved up the ladder and had some natural talent, been habituated to control that kind of base animal life, achieved civic virtue, been able to separate yourself from bodily life and really examine what the intellect is, even if you don't want to treat it like metaphysically, even if you don't want to like kind of hypostasize the intellect, and not all instances of hypostasization are incorrect. But even if you wanted to, you would still have to acknowledge that there are principles in the soul, in the mind, that can be known. How would you come to know those principles? You can't dissect neurons to discover them. The only way is self-reflection. And in order to have that uninterrupted self-reflection, you need to purify yourself. You need to kind of live the life of the mind in its own proper place. And then going beyond our intellect and what we can make contact with there is what the Neoplatonists called, well, the top two virtues are the theurgic virtues, the paradigmatic virtue, where we make contact with those forms in intellect, not just the logoi, which are kind of an emanation out of the forms, The logoi are our reason principles that we have, the seeds of the plans, the blueprints underlying nature. Those things are contained in us. That's why we can kind of like create our Cartesian coordinate grid and graph up some kind of model of the world, because the reason principles are in our soul already. But you can go beyond those, beyond exploring your own intellect, transcend your individual self, and make contact with those eternal forms. Right? That's in the Phaedrus, perceiving beauty herself. That's in the Republic, going out of the cave and seeing the objects of the real world. That is the forms. So that's the paradigmatic virtue. And then above that, the last, the hieratic virtue, is making contact with not that second hypostasis, intellect, in the one intellect soul model, the most kind of basic schema of Neoplatonism, but the first hypostasis, the ground of being, the one, making contact with that. And that would be like samadhi, nirvana. Other systems talk about this. It's interesting that they had 7 steps, and they disagreed somewhat. Olympiodorus mentioned 6, Proclus mentioned 7. But anyway, it's interesting that 7 comes up because that's the number of the basic chakras. There are subordinate chakras in different Hindu systems, but there we're looking at a different kind of concept of virtue. Are we cultivating abilities there? I suppose so, but it's not really abilities of the mind. The Greeks emphasized nous, right? For the Indians, these chakras are all activated through the same prana, the same spiritual energy. The kundalini is uniform in it. It is kind of polarized and exerts a different energy based on the chakra center that it's activating. But the same kind of deal applies. You have to work up from the bottom to have actualization. You have the root chakra, concerned with security, stability. You need to be stable before you go out to become generative. The second chakra, kind of sexual energy per se chakra, is next in line, and you fulfill that by just living. That's still an animal level life, right? Have you accessed those energies? Many people, since we haven't been raised in organic communities, don't know what to do with those energies. And especially when many people are told that it's wrong to flirt with someone. It's wrong to, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. You're bothering them. You shouldn't. Many men are afraid of talking to women because they don't want to be seen as like sexually harassing them. So there's fear. In order to get to the level of the sexual energy, you have to first be secure, right? You have to be stable, feel that you are safe. And that goes for animals too. If they don't feel that they're safe, they're not going to reproduce. So then beyond that second chakra, you have the gut chakra, power, digestion, consuming the energies of the world, bringing them under your control. That's the highest level that an animal can attain. And then you have, and these are very like organic capacities we're talking about, the heart chakra, the 4th chakra, universal love, the capacity for empathy, right? You see this in the life cycle of a business entrepreneur often. Like they move beyond success and start thinking about philanthropy because they've already kind of conquered what they were going to conquer. The next thing that they could conquer is their own greed, selfishness. So they become altruistic. Some of them genuinely do. And then beyond that, beyond compassion, empathy, there is the law, right? How do you effectively instill empathy and altruism in your society? You need to embody the true principles of the law. So the throat chakra is associated with logos, reason, speech. And then we go into the third eye, the 6th chakra, which has to do with intuition, mystic vision, similar to getting into the contemplative and paradigmatic virtues in Neoplatonism. And then last, the 7th chakra above the head, the crown, again, equated with kind of spiritual realization. Many people think that these steps are unnecessary, or that they're totally bogus, but you're dealing with millennia old traditions, not just old from our point in time, but when they were popular, they were ubiquitous for centuries. And many different philosophical schools concurred on these basic points. If you don't have a program like that of self-cultivation, what are the odds that you're going to do any better than all of those ancients, right? They lived a life of struggle far more than we do. We have electricity, the water just comes out of the pipes. We don't have to go collect it from the stream, right? We generally don't have to do our own agriculture. We have it very easy. We don't cultivate ourselves in that way. Like, how are we not going to be these kind of drones? How are we not going to be the bug men, the last man at the end of history, if we don't at least try to have a systematic approach to cultivating virtue? You could say you don't have to cultivate virtue. You don't have to cultivate your abilities to be good. Just do what God wants. Maybe, but I think that God will be able to use you more if you cultivate your own abilities with your own effort. Listen to divine signs in, pursuing a particular course of cultivation, sure. But what are you doing with all of your time? How are you trying to improve yourself? How are you seeking the good? I think we do have to work at this and really pay attention to it because, like I said, our position in history is greatly disadvantaged in respect of cultivating individual virtue. How do we do that? In the Republic, how does Plato want to train his guardians? What do they have to do? They do gymnastics and music when they're young. Music incorporating poetry, even philosophy is technically within music because it's one of those arts inspired by the muses. Although philosophy is kind of held off, dialectics are held off until you're 30. But when you're a kid, it's music and gymnastics. And why? Why do we do that? Well, in Platonism, there is the idea of the subtle body, the pneumatic vehicle, and tempering that and bringing about harmony in that. It is essentially a kind of acoustic medium. And so there are harmonies that build up in the soul and that constitute the soul in the first place, in the kind of more esoteric side of it. But we have to harmonize the brittleness and stiffness of the spirit that's encouraged by gymnastics, and then the kind of flexibility and dynamism of the spirit that is encouraged through music. That's why we have to engage in both. It's not just an intellectual thing. It's physically adapting us to the life of virtue. And then we have to study math, because that's the first place where the human mind is able to make contact with the eternal, right? Things of the perceptual world don't have an eternal existence, except insofar as they partake of these mathematical quantities, relations. We never see the same, perhaps we return back to the same leaf, but the very same leaf is a one-off event. We can't have scientific knowledge of individuals. We only have scientific knowledge when we have causal knowledge, right? And one of those causes, it's not just efficient cause, but we have the causal knowledge of the form of the thing, the formal cause. And so we can identify relations in the abstract and touch something more universal than individual bits of matter. Okay, so we study math. I think not enough of us do that in our free time. We kind of had it shoved down our throat when we were in school. Now we have aversions to it. But mathematics is closely tied to metaphysics because that is the path through which you get to those most ultimate levels of being. How do you touch the true reality? You have to go towards the more eternal. So after all of that, then you study dialectics, you learn the principles of reasoning, and this often involves a kind of breaking up of the persona that you've developed up to that point, because you are resting on habituated knowledge from your upbringing, things that people just told you, that you accepted to be true. But really, they were kind of white lies or noble lies, things that, you could kind of take as a general principle, but you never really questioned. And then you run up against, dialectical methods of analytically parsing these propositions that you received as a kid, and you realize, like, I don't even know what justice means. So how could I know what is just? How can I know what goodness is? Or how do I know what the good life is if I don't know what goodness is? And these sorts of questions, and you start, like, some people become nihilists. They just let go of everything because the reason why they believed what they believed when they were a kid is taken away. And to put in a new system of belief, a new set of reasonings, is difficult because the people who have scientific knowledge about such things are few in number. And you're more likely, once you shatter your faith in what you had with your upbringing, you're more likely now to listen to disaffected aspects of society, right? To join the underclass with their resentments, with all of their complexes of inadequacy. Okay. So that's something. But it would involve some form of gymnastics. Simple gymnastics is best, right? Yoga, stretching, push-ups, sit-ups, body weight exercises. You can spend a lot of time in the gym and get huge, but it's probably not going to be good on your joints when you're older. Probably like a basically competent, strength training regimen is sufficient. We don't have to like try to max aesthetics if we have other good qualities that can, act as our kind of, charismatic attributes. So yeah, we have to work out. We have to study music. Poetry is good, instrumental music. But what are you doing on a day-to-day basis to do these things? I've kind of realized, like, I unintentionally have been following Plato's program for the Guardians. I've studied music since I was very young. I've always remained athletic. I've always kept up with my exercise. I try to learn what math I can. I haven't gone as far as I could in that. And then when I was older, I started into dialectics, although I started too soon, according to the Platonic scheme. But, I have cultivated some abilities that a lot of other people don't possess. I've had many instances in real life and online when someone just can't really believe how much I know about some given obscure topic because, like, why do you know this? Part of that is just being, on the autistic spectrum and being online and having access to a bunch of information so I can kind of nerd out on all these individual topics. But it's also the way that I spend my time. What do I do on a day-to-day basis? What do you do on a day-to-day basis to cultivate your virtue? Gymnastics, music, philosophy. You need to assimilate all of these things. Physics, right? There's a lot to learn. If you really want to know what's good for you, everyone seeks the good, right? This is all about getting to that goal of the good. You can just let Jesus take the wheel and trust that it'll all work out. But then still, what are you doing on a day-to-day basis? Are you listening to divine signs 24/7, right? How often do those signs tell you to become more disciplined and like learn music theory, learn the piano, do something that'll give you a tangible skill that you can pass on to your children? By the way, I'm going to start teaching piano lessons, and I went to Eastman. I know music theory. I can teach, whether you want to learn classical music, I can teach some jazz stuff, whatever it is that you're interested in. I know the theory of it. I play all right. I play for myself. I improvise, and I can play a lot of different stuff. I can listen to a song and figure out the chords in a few seconds and play it. So it's not, I do have a lot of tangible skills to teach in that regard. That's something that I would recommend to people. If you want to get better, learn a skill, right? Everyone should have that. That's part of the Zen approach to self-cultivation. Whether it's calligraphy, you need some specialized skill that you can perfect. And the act of perfecting it is a way of participating in a higher nature than yourself. And you want a lot of those sorts of activities ultimately in your life to keep you sharp, to keep you improving. So if you want to take piano lessons with me, contact me on Skype. I'll also do philosophy lessons if people want to do that. Not to say that I am this like exemplar of virtue and everyone should be following me in doing it, but I do better than most. I do my best. And I think that people have to be out there training the young, teaching the young. Teaching isn't a bad thing Everyone needs to be taught. We need community now more than we ever have because we lack it now more than we ever have. So I'm not worried about coming off as prideful when I say that I have things to teach. The average person in my audience, I have things to teach. But also, all of us have things to teach, and we should cultivate those things, develop expertise, and share these skills. So I'm offering to share skills for my part. Contact me on Skype about that. It really doesn't do any harm, right? Buy a keyboard. They can be quite inexpensive. You'll learn something that'll stick with you. You'll spend your time more productively, right? Most people have some free time to do something positive with. And a lot of people have hobbies that they've pursued, visual arts or, whatever it is. But just make sure you're spending time each day becoming better, cultivating your virtue. And then also, like, there is the paradigmatic excellence of following an example greater than yourself. Okay, so if Christianity is that for you, great. Actually follow Jesus's commandments. Now I'm trying to build the new Plato channel and convert into like a full-time teacher of this stuff because I think the world needs it. I also want to build a physical school because people need that, I think. And I do need support if I'm ever going to get off the ground. So I don't usually ask explicitly for donations, but if you would consider supporting on Patreon, it'd be greatly appreciated. Or music lessons, get something real for it. It's not going to be overpriced. It'll be the fair market value of that kind of thing. And I have stuff to teach. So this is just a video about goodness. What is it exactly? There are a number of philosophical problems, obviously, in ethics that I've touched on here. One could go much more in depth on any of them, but these are the sorts of things we have to think about because we all seek the good, but not all of us know what is really good for us. Not all of us know how to really get it. So we have to look to those examples from the past. Platonism, Stoicism, Tantra, yoga, Christian virtue ethics. Like, look at what these systems have done. What can we employ today? And then lastly, how can we surround ourselves by good men, with good men, so that we can become like them, right? How can we build that better community? I think many of us know that's really what we're looking for at the end of the day. But that doesn't mean we get to stop, pursuing our own virtue. We have to learn math for ourselves. No one can learn math for you. No one can learn music for you. No one can work out for you. That stuff, a lot of things do come down to the individual. So I guess I'm just Jordan Peterson posting in this, but thank you guys for listening. Take care.